The corner store owner extends credit to struggling families, never knowing a child he helped would become mayor who'd transform his life. This simple act of kindness, scribbled in a worn leather ledger book behind the counter of Marino's Market, was merely another line in a growing collection of IOUs that Mr. Marino never truly expected to be repaid. Not in full, anyway. Angelo Marino's weathered hands trembled slightly as he added another name to the list. Outside, rain pelted against the windows of his small corner grocery, the evening sky darkening early as autumn crept toward winter. The bell above the door jingled, a sound that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat after 32 years in this same shop. "Just a few things until payday, Mr. Marino," Sarah Evans whispered, her eyes downcast, holding the hand of a solemn 8-year-old boy whose too small coat had frayed at the sleeves. "David's growing so fast, and with the heating bill this month." Her voice trailed off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks the same shade as the faded red scarf around her neck. Angelo nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Of course, Mrs. Evans. Take what you need." He didn't mention the growing balance beside her name in his ledger. What good would that do? The weight of her dignity was already heavy enough. The boy, David, watched the exchange with eyes too serious for a child. Not the wide-eyed innocence of youth, but the calculating gaze of someone learning early that the world measured worth in dollars and cents. Angelo recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own reflection decades ago, when he'd first arrived in America with nothing but hope and calloused hands. "David, why don't you pick out a candy while your mother shops?" Angelo suggested, reaching beneath the counter for a jar of colorful sweets he kept for special occasions. "On the house." The boy's eyes widened momentarily before narrowing again with suspicion. "Why?" Angelo smiled, the deep lines around his mouth carving valleys in his olive skin. "Because sometimes a little sweetness makes the bitter parts easier to swallow, no?" Something in those words reached the boy. A small hand hesitantly dipped into the jar, emerging with a single wrapped caramel. "Thank you, sir," he murmured, the politeness clearly drilled into him by a mother determined that poverty wouldn't rob her son of manners. Angelo watched as Sarah filled a small basket with the essentials: milk, bread, eggs, the cheapest cuts of meat. Nothing excessive, nothing frivolous, just enough to keep hunger at bay for another week. The same careful shopping he'd observed from dozens of families in the neighborhood as the factory layoffs continued and the recession deepened its grip on their small industrial town of Millfield. As they left, the bell jingling their departure, Angelo sighed and looked at his ledger. The unpaid balances had grown to a sum that made his stomach clench. His own suppliers weren't offering the same generous terms he extended to his customers. Last week, his daughter Elena had noticed the books while visiting from college. "Papa, you can't keep doing this," she'd said, her voice sharp with worry. You'll lose everything." "And what should I do?" he'd replied, gesturing toward the window where mothers hurried past with children in tow. "Tell them to go hungry? This neighborhood raised you, put you through school. These are our people. Business isn't charity," Elena had countered, the practical voice of a new generation. "You can't save everyone." Those words echoed in Angelo's mind as he closed the shop that night, pulling the metal security gate down with a rattling finality that matched his mood. Perhaps Elena was right. Perhaps he was a fool, clinging to old-world values in a new world that valued profit above people. The walk to his small apartment above the store felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the knowledge that his retirement savings were dwindling, sacrificed to keep the store afloat. At 67, he should be thinking about Florida sunshine, not foreclosure notices. But as he climbed the narrow stairs, the image of young David Evans and his too small coat lingered. Some prices were worth paying. Angelo had always believed this, even when belief came at a cost. Winter in Millfield was particularly brutal that year. Snow piled in dirty heaps along the sidewalks, and the wind howled through the gaps in Angelo's old storefront windows. Business slowed to a trickle as people stayed home, conserving gas money and heating costs. The Evans family continued their weekly visits, Sarah's face growing thinner while David shot up another inch, his wrists now protruding awkwardly from his coat sleeves. Angelo noticed how the boy would help his mother carry the groceries, his small face set with determination. Sometimes when Sarah was selecting items, David would whisper questions to Angelo about the store. "How do you know how much of everything to order? Why don't you sell the fancy cereals like the supermarket? Do you own the whole building?" Angelo answered patiently, something about the boy's curiosity warming him more effectively than the ancient heater struggling in the corner. Unlike most children who eyed only the candy display, David seemed to see the entire store, the logistics, the mathematics, the human exchanges that comprised commerce. One February evening, as closing time approached and snow began to fall again, David arrived alone, breathless and red-cheeked from running. "Mr. Marino," he panted, "Mom's sick. She sent me for medicine and soup." He held out a crumpled $5 bill, clearly their emergency fund. "She said to tell you we'll pay the rest next week." Angelo's heart constricted. "What kind of sick, David? Does she need a doctor?" The boy's shoulders slumped slightly. "She says it's just a cold, but she's been coughing for days. She can't miss more work or they'll fire her." Angelo filled a bag with cold medicine, cough syrup, chicken soup, tea, and honey, far more than the $5 would cover. He added oranges, tissues, and a chocolate bar, then handed the heavy bag to David. "This should help," he said, "and don't worry about the money." David's gaze was direct, his chin lifting slightly. "We'll pay you back, every penny." The certainty in the boy's voice, not a childish promise, but a solemn vow, made Angelo pause. "I know you will," he replied, realizing he truly believed it. Before David left, Angelo added his own worn wool scarf to the bag. "For your walk home, it's getting colder." The boy hesitated, then nodded once, a gesture so adult it seemed out of place on his young frame, before disappearing into the swirling snow. 3 days later, Sarah Evans was hospitalized with pneumonia. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, and Angelo kept the store open late, becoming an unofficial collection point for casseroles and childcare offers. He learned that David was staying with a neighbor while his mother recovered, stoically attending school and visiting the hospital daily. Angelo prepared a care package, proper groceries, not just convenience foods, and a new coat he'd noticed on clearance at the department store. He delivered it himself to the neighbor's apartment, where David answered the door with shadows under his eyes. "How is your mother doing?" Angelo asked gently. "Better," David replied, his voice small but steady. "They say she can come home next week if she rests." Angelo nodded, handing over the package. "This is from the neighborhood. Everyone is thinking of you both." David looked inside the bag, his composure faltering when he saw the coat. He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. "Thank you, Mr. Marino," he whispered, fingers clutching the fabric. "You're welcome, David," Angelo said, resisting the urge to ruffle the boy's hair. Something told him that David had moved beyond such childish comforts. "Your mother is strong, and so are you." As Angelo turned to leave, David called after him. "Mr. Marino, how do you decide?" "Decide what, son? Who to help? Who gets credit? There must be rules, right?" Angelo considered the question seriously. "There are no strict rules. I look at character, not collateral. I see how people treat others, how hard they try, whether they're honest about their circumstances." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes you just know who's worth investing in." David nodded thoughtfully, as though filing this information away for future reference. As the winter months passed, Angelo watched David take on increasingly adult responsibilities. The boy would come to the store with a carefully written shopping list, counting out exact change, negotiating which items they could afford that week. When Sarah returned to work, David often stopped by after school, sometimes helping Angelo stock shelves or sweep the floor, refusing payment except for the occasional candy. "I'm working off our tab," he explained matter-of-factly when Angelo protested. By spring, Angelo had noticed something changing in the Evans family. Sarah had found a better job at the hospital where she'd been treated, and their grocery selections expanded slightly. David's school marks were exceptional, according to the proud updates Sarah shared during checkout. The ledger balance beside their name gradually decreased as small payments arrived each week, often delivered by David himself. What Angelo didn't realize, couldn't have known, was how deeply his actions had influenced the boy's developing worldview. While Angelo saw only a child helping his mother through hard times, David was absorbing lessons that would shape his future. The power of community, the dignity preserved through generosity without humiliation, and the mathematics of sustainable kindness. Years passed. The recession eventually eased, but Millfield never fully recovered from the factory closures. Angelo's store remained, though Elena had convinced him to modernize somewhat, adding lottery tickets and a coffee station that became a morning gathering spot for neighborhood regulars. His ledger of credit accounts remained, though the names changed as families moved away or improved their circumstances. Angelo himself moved more slowly now, his back curved slightly from decades behind the counter. At 75, retirement remained a distant dream, as the store barely generated enough profit to cover expenses. The bell above the door jingled one autumn morning as Angelo was restocking the bread shelf. He turned to find a tall young man in a crisp blue suit standing in the entrance. looking around with an expression of nostalgic wonder. "Good morning," Angelo called. "Can I help you find something?" The young man smiled, and something in that smile tugged at Angelo's memory. "Hello, Mr. Marino," he said. "I'm not sure if you remember me. It's been a while." Angelo squinted, recognition dawning slowly. "David? David Evans?" The young man's smile widened. "Yes, sir." Angelo came forward, his weathered hands extended. "Of course I remember. Look at you, all grown up and so professional." He clasped David's hand warmly. "How is your mother? And what brings you back to the neighborhood?" "Mom's doing well. She remarried a few years ago. A kind man she met at the hospital. They moved to Columbus." David looked around the store again. "As for why I'm here, I actually came looking for you specifically." Angelo raised his eyebrows. "For me? What can an old shopkeeper do for a successful young man like yourself?" David laughed softly. "I'm not that successful yet, but I'm working on it. I just finished law school at State. I've come back to Millfield to join the city attorney's office." "A lawyer!" Angelo exclaimed, pride swelling in his chest as though David were his own grandson. "Your mother must be very proud." "She is," David acknowledged, "but I wanted to tell you something important." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Do you remember that winter when I was 8 and my mom got pneumonia?" Angelo nodded. "Of course. That was a difficult time for many families." "It was," David agreed. "But what you did for us, extending credit when we couldn't pay, the medicine, the coat, it changed everything for me." His voice grew quiet. "I used to think the world was divided into people who had enough and people who didn't, and that was just how things were. But you showed me there was another category. People who had enough to share and chose to do so." Angelo felt heat rising to his cheeks. "I did very little. Just what anyone would do." "No," David said firmly. "Not what anyone would do. What you did was extraordinary, though you made it seem ordinary. And it wasn't just us. It was dozens of families in this neighborhood." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Which brings me to why I'm here." He handed the envelope to Angelo, who opened it with curiosity. Inside was a check for an amount that made the old man blink in confusion. "Huh? What is this?" Angelo asked. "The full amount my mother and I owed you, with interest," David explained. "I've been saving since my first job at 16. Mom contributed too." Angelo stared at the check, then shook his head, trying to hand it back. No, this is too much. Your balance was paid off years ago." "Not according to my calculations," David insisted, "and not including the impact your generosity had on my life. Please, Mr. Marino, this matters to me." Something in the young man's expression, that same determination Angelo had seen in the 8-year-old boy, made him reluctantly fold the check and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said simply. "This will help more than you know." David nodded, then glanced at his watch. "I have to get to an appointment, but I wanted to ask, may I stop by again? Perhaps this weekend? There's something else I'd like to discuss with you." "Anytime," Angelo replied warmly. "The door is always open for you." After David left, Angelo took out the check again, staring at the amount in disbelief. It would cover the repair of the leaking roof and the new refrigeration unit Elena had been urging him to buy. Perhaps there would even be enough left to consider cutting back his hours a bit. True to his word, David returned that weekend, this time dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more like the boy Angelo remembered. They sat at the small table by the coffee station, the store momentarily empty of other customers. "I've been thinking about this neighborhood a lot while I was away at school," David began, cradling a cup of coffee between his hands. "About what it needs, what would make life better for families like mine was." Angelo nodded encouragingly. "The city has some development funds that haven't been allocated yet." David continued, "As part of the legal team, I'll have input on how those resources are used. I'd like to advocate for revitalizing this commercial district. Grants for facade improvements, subsidies for essential businesses like yours, maybe even a small business incubator in that empty warehouse on Elm." Angelo listened, surprised by the scope of David's vision. "That sounds wonderful, but why are you telling me this?" "Because I need allies who understand this community," David explained. "People respect you, Mr. Marino. If you supported these initiatives, others would listen." "I'm just a shopkeeper," Angelo protested. "I know nothing about development or politics." David smiled. "You know everything that matters. The families, their needs, what makes a neighborhood work. And you've shown more economic wisdom in how you ran this store than most of my economics professors." His expression grew more serious. "Will you help me?" Be an advisor of sorts? Angelo felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. If you think an old man's opinions are useful, then yes. And so began an unlikely partnership. David brought proposals and plans to Angelo, who offered practical insights about the neighborhood's needs. They held community meetings in the store after hours, where residents shared their hopes and concerns. Angelo translated for the older Italian and Spanish-speaking neighbors, ensuring their voices were included. Over the next 2 years, small changes began appearing in the neighborhood. The cracked sidewalks were repaired. Grants became available for storefront improvements. The empty warehouse was transformed into a marketplace for local vendors and a community center with after-school programs. Angelo's store received funding for energy-efficient upgrades that dramatically reduced his utility costs. David's reputation grew within city government. His combination of legal expertise, community connections, and genuine compassion made him unusually effective. When the mayor announced he wouldn't seek another term, David's name began circulating as a potential candidate. "You should run," Angelo told him one evening as they closed up after a community meeting. "You have the vision this city needs." David looked startled. "I'm only 31. Too young." "Nonsense," Angelo scoffed. "I've watched you build consensus among people 3 times your age. You listen. You follow through. These are rare qualities in any politician." David was quiet for a moment. "Would you support me? Publicly, I mean." Angelo clapped him on the shoulder. "With everything I have." The campaign was grueling. David's youth and progressive ideas faced resistance from the city's old guard. His opponent, a wealthy businessman, outspent him dramatically. But David had something money couldn't buy: authentic connections throughout the community, built one conversation at a time. Angelo's store became an unofficial campaign headquarters. The old shopkeeper spoke passionately to his customers about the young man who understood their struggles because he had lived them. Elena, visiting from Chicago where she now lived, was amazed to find her father so energized, staying up late to stuff envelopes and make phone calls. "I haven't seen you this alive in years, Papa," she remarked. Angelo smiled. "It feels good to fight for something important again." On election night, the store closed early so everyone could gather at campaign headquarters. The room erupted when the results were announced. David had won by a narrow margin. In his victory speech, he thanked his mother and stepfather who had driven in for the occasion, his campaign team, and the voters who had taken a chance on him. Then he said something that caused cameras to pan to a surprised Angelo in the crowd. "And I want to thank the man who showed me what leadership truly means, not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of faith in his community. Mr. Angelo Marino taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you're willing to share when others are in need." His corner store was the first place I experienced what a caring community could be, and creating that feeling citywide will be my mission as your mayor. The crowd cheered as David gestured for Angelo to join him on stage. The old man shook his head in embarrassment, but Elena nudged him forward. As they embraced before the cameras, Angelo whispered, "I'm so proud of you, son." David's term as mayor began with the energy and optimism of youth, tempered by the wisdom he'd gathered from mentors like Angelo. He instituted programs that reflected the lessons learned in Marino's market. Economic policies that recognized the dignity of struggling families, community initiatives that fostered connection rather than dependency, investments in neighborhoods that had been overlooked. For Angelo, the changes were both public and deeply personal. As part of a new heritage business designation, his store received grants for renovation and expansion. David appointed him to chair a small business advisory council, where his practical experience proved invaluable. The neighborhood around the store gradually transformed, not through gentrification that displaced residents, but through thoughtful improvements that served existing families. Perhaps most significantly, Angelo found himself surrounded by a renewed sense of community. Young families moved into formerly vacant homes, drawn by the improving schools and revitalized commercial district. His store became busier than it had been in decades, allowing him to hire 2 part-time employees, both neighborhood residents who needed flexible schedules. On Angelo's 80th birthday, David and the city council surprised him by renaming the renovated park across from his store Marino Plaza. At the dedication ceremony, Angelo found himself uncharacteristically speechless as David unveiled a small bronze plaque that read, "In honor of Angelo Marino, who sustained this community with food for the body and nourishment for the spirit." His generosity planted seeds that continue to grow. Later that evening, as friends and neighbors gathered in the store for cake and coffee, Angelo pulled David aside. "You've transformed this neighborhood," he said, gesturing toward the window where children played in the newly dedicated plaza, illuminated by decorative streetlights that had replaced the broken lamps of years past. David shook his head. "I only build upon the foundation you laid. Every family you helped through hard times, every child you slipped a piece of candy to, every time you wrote in that ledger without knowing if you'd ever be repaid, those were investments in this community's future." Angelo's eyes grew misty. "I never expected returns on those investments. That's precisely why they yielded so much," David replied, squeezing the older man's shoulder. "The best kind of giving comes without expectations." As the celebration continued around them, Angelo reflected on the strange, winding path his life had taken. The struggling immigrant boy who had opened a small store with dreams of modest success could never have imagined becoming a mentor to a mayor, a respected community elder, a man whose name would remain in the neighborhood long after he was gone. His ledger of credit accounts still existed, though it was smaller now as the community's economic health improved. Some debts had been forgiven over the years, others repaid in unexpected ways. But Angelo had come to understand that the true ledger of his life was kept in moments, not money, in the connections formed across his scarred wooden counter, in the trust built through thousands of small interactions, in the knowledge that his belief in people's inherent worth had made a difference. That night, after the last guest had departed and Elena had gone upstairs to sleep in her childhood bedroom, Angelo stood alone in his store. Moonlight filtered through the new awning, casting gentle shadows across the polished floors. He ran his hand along the counter, feeling the grooves and nicks accumulated over decades, a tangible record of a life spent in service to others. In the quiet, he remembered the boy in the too small coat, selecting a single caramel with careful deliberation. How could he have known then that this small kindness, this simple extension of credit, would set in motion events that would not only revitalize a neighborhood, but give new purpose to his twilight years? Angelo smiled to himself. Perhaps this was the most valuable lesson of all, that we never truly know the ripple effects of our actions, the ways in which our choices might echo through other lives. All we can do is act with compassion in the moment before us, extending what credit we can to a world often short on kindness. Outside, the streetlights illuminated Marino Plaza, where tomorrow children would play and neighbors would gather. Angelo locked the door, the familiar jingle of the bell, a musical counterpoint to the beating of his grateful heart. The corner store owner had extended credit to struggling families, never knowing a child he helped would become mayor who'd transform his life. But in the economy of the human spirit, Angelo had received the richest returns of all. The knowledge that his faith in people, his willingness to invest in their potential when others would not, had helped shape not just a neighborhood, but a vision for what community could be. And that, he reflected as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, was a dividend beyond price.